Well, good morning. Am I on? We good? Because I can't hear me. Can you hear me? No? Check that. Is it on? How are we doing? Yes? No? Maybe? All right. Oh, I can hear me breathing now. Well, it happened right when I sighed, so my sigh must have made the volume come on. Good morning, my name is Pastor Shane, and I'm so happy to be preaching over here today again. Couple of things before we dive in. I think in your program that you probably have this insert, and on the second page it says ways to grow, and it talks about, these are all of our discipleship groups. Now, I said this at 9:30, so I'm going to say it to you too, that discipleship, growing in discipleship, becoming more mature disciples of followers of Jesus Christ is not an add-on to the church. It's not an add-on. It's not something extra we do if we can. You're expected as Christians, as United Methodists especially, to be a part of a small group, to be a part of growing in discipleship. It's literally built into our mission statement as United Methodists. We are to make and mature disciples of Jesus Christ for the transformation of the world. These groups are how we do it here at this church. You can look at it and see that we've got a ton of them going on and more coming up. I just draw your attention to a couple that have been together that we would love you to be a part of, and those are our Quaker Steak groups on the first and third Tuesday of the month at 6 o'clock at Quaker Steak in Austintown. See, what happened was the guys were getting together and we were doing this thing, and it was so cool that our wives decided to join us. And we said, nope, you have to sit at a different table. This is a men's group. So we have a men's group and oh, come on, Beth. That's how it happened. Stop it. Yeah, well, whatever. So we have that. But you can look at this. We have a couple that are just now restarting up on the second and fourth Tuesdays at Giorgio's in Niles. That's Karen Fisher's new group. Here at the Connections Cafe on Thursdays, the second and fourth Thursdays, we have Phil Fisher. And so look, if none of these work with a time that you can do it, we will start new groups. We can have as many groups as people want to be a part of, and even maybe more than people want to be a part of. Here's the thing, though. Discipleship, again, it's not an add-on, it's an expectation. Jesus expected his followers to be disciples. Now, he realized that some of you guys were just along for the ride, and so that wasn't going to happen to everybody. But he said, do this thing. If you chose not to, he's like, all right, cool, go do your own thing. And then he worked with the people who were committed. So this has been a part of our faith, a part of our journey since the beginning, since Christianity was birthed. So please get involved. It will help you. It will help us, and it's what we're supposed to do. So there is that. There's also, on a more light note, next Sunday after church at 1 o'clock, we're doing for the third year in a row. We're doing Irons Mill Farmstead. I think it's Hermitage, around that way. It's just inside of PA. Last year we did, it was 94 degrees. This year, what did we say? It's going to be like 60? So that's cool. So if you didn't I made a Facebook event for it. I accidentally made it private. So if you didn't get invited to that, and that is something you want to bring your kids to, let me know, and because you can pay for that online. But that is next Sunday. So you have to pay for it this week. So if you're interested in that, just see me after the service or text me, get me on Facebook, whatever. Let me know that you want to come. It was a blast. We always seem to have a great time. My family, Angela and my kids have been going since Carmen was born. So it's a good time. Okay, all of that to get into the message today. I'm going to give you a quick recap of where we've been so you know where we are. First week, we started talking about that people may have left faith, God, church, whatever, unnecessarily. And that was pretty much that message, talking about why sometimes that happens. Last week, we spent our time deconstructing fake gods. So we've done, in the past 2 weeks, a lot of deconstruction work, kind of trying to clear the way. And the question that sort of begs to be asked, and was asked of me this week, was, well, if we're not supposed to believe in those, what is God like? Like what God are we supposed to believe in? Because I thought God was like that. If God isn't like that, then what is God like, right? That's today. Today we're going to restart restoring, reconstructing. We're going to start building up. We've been tearing down. That's kind of scary. It does get scary when we start breaking away things. And then people are like, well, now what do we do? Well, this weekend, next week, where it's the what do we do part, it's the rebuilding phase, which the Browns have been in since forever. Oh, speaking of the Browns, yeah, I was at the Thursday game. I'm not saying they won because a man of God went, but I'm just saying they didn't get a win before that. So take it for however you will. Anyway, so that's where we are. So I don't know what you said over there, but I heard words, and it probably wasn't good. So that's where we are. Today we're going to be talking about the God of Jesus, right? We're going to talk about the God of Jesus. For me, wondering about God, and I know I'm not alone in this, but I use the word struggle, but really I have been considering about God most of my life. Even when I growing up in an anti-religious household, it wasn't just that my mom and my dad were not religious. They were actively anti-religious. My mom hated God, and she hated the church even more. So I grew up in this way. So sometimes my questions about God were a little negative, but at least I was thinking about God. I was wondering, what is God like? Right? I was wondering, what is God like? As I grew older, and this has been the foundation of this series. We've talked about a childhood faith that grows up, or sometimes doesn't. It doesn't grow along with you, right? But as I grew older, a little bit older, I got this faith, this childhood faith, given to me by my grandma, not my mom, by my grandma. My mom's mom. It was a little weird, but she tried, right? But then I have a trauma at 10. That's my first trauma that makes me question it all, to the point where I was just like, I didn't not believe, but I certainly was like real angry at God. Like my dad died when I was 10. So this childhood faith, by the way, the God that my grandma handed me was the bodyguard God, right? Bad things don't happen to good people. Actually, bad things don't happen at all. They shouldn't, because if they did, why would God let that happen, right? Which is next week's message, by the way. That is probably the biggest reason why people walk away from faith, is this struggle with the question, why do bad things happen? Right? Why is there injustice in the world? Pastor Vicky's going to address that, because when I try to address that, I start yelling. So we decided that probably wasn't a good idea. I can do this one better. So I had bodyguard God, hit the trauma, all of a sudden bodyguard God lets me down, and I'm like angry at bodyguard God. Turns out I wasn't actually angry at God, I was angry at this version of God, right? Then I move a little further along and I started asking questions, and things started to unravel a little bit until I hit my second trauma, right? And it just all blows up, right? My second trauma was trying to figure out how the Bible works, and I'm not going to go into that a lot today, but just know that I had a certain belief about what the Bible should be. All of a sudden, that expectation was cracked, and I held on to it like this, right? And I think I've used this imagery here before, where if you put a firecracker in the middle of this, it's going to blow my hand off, right? And that's exactly what happened to my faith. There was a crack in my faith, and it blew up to the point where I just walked away altogether. I say all that, though, to say that even in those moments of being angry or walking away altogether, I still ask questions. I was still thinking about God. Like, even when I said I didn't believe, one of the things I used to say when I was an atheist, or even what I would say I wasn't a full-blown atheist, I couldn't commit to that. I couldn't commit to being a full-blown atheist. I was like a really hardcore, really, really, like, to the fringe agnostic, we could say that. But even in those moments, when I didn't believe, I would say things like, I don't believe there's a God, but I understand why people do. Like, I understand why people believe. Because even then, I felt really in my heart that we're hardwired to believe in something bigger than ourselves, right? We're hardwired to at least look for or think that there is something larger, right? And so I still asked all these questions. I studied probably, before seminary, I studied religion the most in my atheistic period. Kind of a weird thing, but you need to know how to fight against your enemy, so you study your enemy, right? But I asked a lot of questions, and I knew that we needed something bigger ourselves. Do you know why people, Even if you don't believe, do you know why we continue to search out there for something else, something bigger? Because even the biggest humanist, and a humanist is a person who just believes it begins and ends with us, and that we are either the savior or destructor of the world. Like we are the pinnacle of evolution, basically. Humanistic thought is we are all that there is. Even the most staunch humanist can't fully buy into that. And the reason why that is because we understand that if we look at human history, humans have never lived up to the expectation of God, right? We have never shown that we can love unconditionally, or be, not even love, we can't even be good unconditionally or even with conditions for long periods of time. We have done some of the most amazing work, right? As a species, we have come up with, we are perfecting things like art and music and all these things. We've come up with great inventions, and humanity has taken giant steps forward, right? Especially recently in the last 100 years, right? But we've also been the species that we have done some of the worst evil in this world. So when it comes down to it, human history, we've never been able to live up to our own expectations, even as a species. Right? We expect something better than what we've given. So from somewhere inside, somewhere we're hardwired. Again, we're hardwired. We're coded to look for something beyond ourselves. Even if we believe there's all there is, we still. Stephen Hawking was this way. He believed that this was all there was. Everything was determined, but he still, physics is the study of something you can't, an unseen, he looked at something bigger than humanity, right? So I've struggled with that. I've just struggled with the idea of something bigger than myself. I know I'm not alone here. I know I'm not alone in this room. My hope is that everybody in this room is here, at least in part because you're curious about God, right? I hope you're not just here because you think it makes you a good person. Spoiler alert, it doesn't, okay? I hope you're here for other reasons, and one of those is because you're curious about God. Maybe you have questions, really hard questions. Let me give you an example of something that was brought up to me recently. And I give kudos to this person for asking the question, even if it was really she was asking about a different God, right? And the question was this. She says, if a drunk driver causes a crash and the people in the other car die, right? And then that drunk driver goes on his way and goes down the road and gets into another crash and he dies. Was that God? Did God do that? Now, that happened in the middle of one of my sermons recently, so it had nothing to do with anything I said, but when I think back on it, at least she was struggling to figure out who God is, right? That was awesome. And so, I want to go back to her now because I haven't done it since, but I want to go back to her now and give her a hug and say, thank you for thinking about God. Thank you for trying to figure this out. Because how many of us, and by the way, I'm not sure exactly which God that falls into, but maybe it's one we didn't talk about, and that is, vengeance God. The God that, bouncer God. The God who, when people start causing a ruckus, just kicks them out. That's bodyguard, or a bouncer God. She believed in the bouncer God. So unfortunately for her, I was like, I don't want to give away the plot point of my sermon today, but I'll get there. Ultimately, though, I was really happy that she was thinking about God. Are you? Somebody in here, I know somebody in here is thinking, questioning, wondering, struggling about, if we can't believe in this list of gods we just deconstructed last week, what do we believe in? What is our God? What is our God? What is the God we're supposed to believe in? If we can't believe in those, what do we believe in? Well, I've said it before, and this will be my mantra, my whole career, my whole time as a pastor and beyond, that Christians start with Jesus. We start with Jesus. All of our questions start there. At least all of our answers to our questions start there. They start with Jesus. So, why? It seems weird to say why, like ask why does it start with Jesus? Because it should seem obvious. If we're Christians, literally little Christs, if we are followers of Jesus, we should just expect that what Jesus says has weight. But hey Tyler, throw up the scripture there that John 14. If you really know me, yeah. So this is from the book of John, the Gospel of John. This is sort of Jesus saying, here's why you can trust what I say about God. If you really know me, you will know my Father as well. From now on, you do know him, and you have seen him. Philip said, Lord, show us the Father, and that will be enough for us. So Jesus literally just said something, and Philip's like, listens like I listen, right? And says, yeah, but just show us anyway. And Jesus says, don't you know me, Philip? By the way, I love that he calls him out, and by name. He's not just like being general. He's like, don't you know? Don't you know me, even after I have been among you for such a long time? Anyone who has seen me has seen the Father. And then he goes on, and he says, believe that I am in the Father and that the Father is in me. Says the words that I speak to you, I don't speak on my own authority, but the Father living in me. So he's really ramming home this idea that God is in him. He's in God, God is in him. Believe me when I say that I am in the Father and the Father in me. And then he stops, and basically the next part is like, if you don't believe what I'm saying, at least believe in the evidence of the works themselves. So even Jesus realizes that just because you say something doesn't mean people are going to believe it. He's literally saying here, actions sometimes speak louder than words. So if you can't believe what I'm saying, at least believe what I'm doing. So in this passage, Jesus is saying, if you want to know what God says, listen to me. If you want to know what God says, listen to me. If you want to know what God's up to, watch me. So Jesus is saying, I am a trustworthy source here. God is in me. I am in God. If you want to know what God is saying, listen to me. If you want to know what God's up to, watch me. So this is why we can trust what Jesus says. Jesus and the Father are working together. So that really does beg the question, what did Jesus say about God? What did Jesus say about God? Well, first, Jesus says God is spirit. God is spirit. Throw up that next passage. In John 4, earlier on in John, he's telling the woman at the well, and if you don't know the story of the woman in the well, basically Jesus is at this well, and oh no, my seminary training, he's talking to Samaritan, right? Thank you. Oh my gosh. He's talking to a Samaritan woman, and if you don't know, that's a big deal, okay? Just the fact that he's talking to a woman in public, he's talking to a Samaritan woman who is like basically their enemy, like they don't like each other. But he's talking to this woman. He gets to a point in there where he says this. He says, God is spirit, and his worshipers must worship him, or worship in the spirit and in truth. So he's saying God is spirit. Now, to us, that might not seem like a big deal to say that. Like in this world right now, it might not seem like a big deal to say God is spirit. Because honestly, that's what we would expect as modern people. Right? As modern people who think of the world in the way that we do, it makes sense to say something like, God is spirit. Because think about if you believe in the Big Bang, which that's the prevailing scientific theory about how the universe began. And there are many, 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 many Christians who believe this. I believe this. I think it's right now, and it's the best that we have. All right, but what you do is you take everything back to the singularity, the point of nothing becoming something, and you have to then ask the question, who, what, why? Why did that happen? How did that happen? Who made that happen? That starts to get beyond questions of science and the how and move into the realm of religion and as to why and the who, the what or whatever, all of that stuff. So, but nothing produced something, right? An immaterial produced the material world. It went from nothing to something. If you believe that, and I believe that, then saying God is spirit makes perfect sense because there was nothing, something spiritual, something ethereal, something non-material. Right? So if you believe that, then to say God is spirit makes sense. It's what the modern world understands. But catch this, when Jesus said this, it was a huge deal. Because the gods, as they existed in Jesus' day and before, were always sort of like superhumans, to put it in a way that we might understand. They were physical, tangible beings that lived, whether on a mountain, on a cloud, somewhere, but they were basically people with powers, right? Superpowers. So for him to now say, for Jesus to say that God is spirit was something pretty much unheard of at that point. And it's kind of why we are in a place now where we can accept this without even flinching, because Jesus said it first. And not only did he say it first, but he said it to what other people would look at as his enemy, right? So he said it to a person who he shouldn't have even been talking to in the first place. He didn't say it among his friends who would have been like, it's okay. He said it to somebody who, if they had wanted to hurt him, could have taken that information and said, dude, this guy is insane. Listen to what he is saying, right? Jesus said God is spirit. So that's easy enough. I mean, that's easy enough for us. But that's the first thing. Jesus said God is spirit, right? Next, and this one's a little harder maybe, but Jesus said God is Father. Now, I say it's harder. It might not be harder for you. This was hard for me. Even as I'm doing this message this week, it changed my thinking in a very good way. But this idea that God is Father, Jesus said God is Father. Jesus, in Luke 11:2, when his disciples, hear that, we say this every week. We say the Lord's Prayer that's based on Luke 11:2. They ask him, how do we pray? And he says, when you pray, say Father. Do you guys have a problem saying Father? I know for me, I have to rip it out of myself to say it, because I didn't have good examples, good dad examples. My biological dad, my bio dad, as somebody refers to them, was probably the worst example of what it meant to be a man, right? And my stepdad, for a long, long time, also just not good. So for me to say God is Father was like, that's no good for me to say God is Father, because fathers suck, right? And even you could say that God is a good reflection of, but that's not what Jesus is saying here, right? But I want us to get into a little bit of practice. For those of us who may not say Father, call God Father, I want you to say it with me. When Jesus said, when you pray, say Father. Let's do it again. When you pray, say Father. One more time. When you pray, say, doesn't that just feel good? If it doesn't feel good to you, maybe if you're like me and it doesn't feel good, it's because you're thinking of a reflection of your earthly father. Right? You're thinking, when you say the word Father, it holds such negative weight for you. Right? But I would bet, even if that's true, that you couldn't say God is Mother. When you pray, say Mother. I'm not saying you shouldn't. I'm just saying I bet that would be difficult, right? Because it's not what we do. Here is what Jesus is doing. Jesus isn't saying God is a man up in the sky. He's not like granddad, perfect granddad, sit up in the sky with his eternal Werther's original. It's just not. It's not. That one got a lot more laughs at the 9:30. Just so you know. You're letting me down, folks. Maybe you're just like, I don't know, is that funny? Can we make fun of old people? I don't know. Here's the thing. Jesus isn't saying that God is a reflection of your earthly father. Jesus is saying that God is the perfection of the idea of father. It's the perfection of the idea of father. Jesus is saying to them, in your limited ability to understand, your finiteness, your inability to see everything, the closest that I can come to telling you what God is like, the nature of God, is to say that God is the perfection of Father, is Father. And he said Father to them then, because in their world at that time, the most important relationship, or the one that seemed to drive society, was the relationship with Father. The Father was the head and all of that. Now, we live in a different world, a different time, but that was it. And so he looked at probably the pinnacle relationship in social society at that time and said, God is the perfection of this idea. So if it's still hard for you to say Father, that's fine. I give you a different way to look at it. I would say, instead of saying God is the perfection of Father, say God is the perfection of relationship. Period. God is the perfection of relationship. God is Father. God is mother. God is sister. God is brother. God is your best friend. God is whatever relationship, if perfected in your mind, makes you go, oh my God. Literally. Oh my God. God is the perfection of that relationship. God is the perfection of relationship. So God is spirit, and God is the perfection of relationship. Why is that important? Because Jesus says God is spirit. That is very impersonal. Spirit is just like, you can't grab that. You can't touch that. Spirit don't care. Spirit does not care. However, Father cares. Mother cares. Brother, sister, whatever. Jesus in this moment is saying that God is personal. The God of Jesus was spirit, but the God of Jesus was personal. The God of Jesus cared. And that's what personal, it's how we relate, how things relate, how people relate, how entities relate, right? It's personal. When we say don't take it personally, it's like we don't want it to embody us. But that's what Jesus is literally saying. I am in the Father, and the Father's in me. God is personal. So again, God is the perfection of relationship. God is personal. That's hugely important for Christians, especially, because here's the thing. Let me get to the next point because it feeds into that as well. So God is spirit, God is Father. Finally, God is love. God is love. Again, this may or may not be a mind-blowing revelation to you, that God is love, because we live in a world where a lot of people say, well, I'm not religious. I just believe God loves everybody. Well, that's a distinctly Christian idea. That didn't exist before Jesus said it, right? Or before Christians believed it, that God loves everybody, that God's love is for everybody, that God literally is love. Before that, again, superhumans living on a cloud, they didn't care about people. They cared about themselves. You ever read any Greek mythology, Roman mythology, Norse mythology? If you ever read any of that, you'll realize that the gods were bad hombres, man. They didn't care. They cared about themselves. It was literally like watching Washington, D.C. on a God level. They didn't care about you. They cared about them, and they just used you as a pawn to get what they wanted. Now, I'm probably going to beat up outside because how dare you talk about our government like that? It's true. It goes across red or blue. They don't care. But literally, that's what the gods were like. And then Jesus comes along and teaches this idea that God is love and that God cares about everyone. Uniquely Christian idea. That didn't exist before Christians. Okay? That didn't exist before Christians. Without stepping on Pastor Vicky's toes for next week, this does start to get into the realm of, if God is love and God is great, then why do these things happen? Right? Why do these things happen? Well, I'm going to go out on a limb and say that the evil in the world, the badness in the world, the things that happen in the world are distortions, transformations of something that existed before. Right? So evil is a transformation of what's the word that I want to use? Evil's a bad reflection of love. Here's what I mean, okay? Think of it this way. One of the books I read for studying this series, I think it was called Stealing from God. It was either Stealing from God or The Language of God. 2 different books, both great. You should read them. One of them says, shade requires the sun. Shade requires the sun. What that means is that you can have the sun, You can accept that we know the sun. The sun does not require shade to exist. It just exists. It pre-exists the shade. However, you can never have the shade without the sun. Something gets in the way of the sun to make the shade. Or as I put it earlier, darkness exists because something got in the way of light. Darkness exists when something gets in the way of light. Darkness doesn't exist without light. Something gets in the way. Evil exists because something got in the way of love, which says love was there first. Love was there first, which means that God can be love. God is love. Something got in the way of that, and now there's evil. That doesn't require God to let anything happen. Something got in the way of love. So love must pre-exist unlove, which gets me back to the idea that when we say things like, I'm not religious, but I just believe God loves everybody, well, that's a uniquely Christian idea that accepts that God, that God is love. God is spirit. God is the perfection of relationship. God is love. That's it. That's Jesus' God in a nutshell. So if you can't believe, and you shouldn't believe in the fake gods that we deconstructed last week, Jesus hands you. Jesus came. Jesus talked about. The God of Jesus is spirit. But the God of Jesus is personal. So the God of Jesus is the perfection of relationship. By the way, if you ever want a really good sort of discussion around this idea of relationship and perfection of relationship, look at Paul Young's discussion of the Trinity, sort of his presentation of the Trinity in the book The Shack. In the book The Shack, he uses this idea of Trinity, or this idea of relationship and the perfection of relationship to talk about the Trinity in a way that I wish scholars and theologians throughout the millennia could have had, because there's been so much talk about what is the Trinity, what does it do, how does it exist, and then this non-seminary educated dude comes along and he's like, it's relationship, man. And that's it. God is spirit, God is the perfection of relationship, and God is love. So, what do I want you to do with all that? Because I always give a homework assignment, because I just do, right? So what do I want you to do with this knowledge? Well, what I want you to do is go grab onto it for yourself. Because it's easy. Again, words are great, actions are better, and the things that you accept on your own are even better. Here's what I want you to do. I want you to go read the book of John. Right? Some of you may have never cracked a Bible. Fine. This is a good excuse to do it. The book of John is not that long. It seems daunting, but it really isn't that long. Go read the book of John. The Gospel of John, Matthew, Mark, Luke, John. Get a New Testament, it's the fourth one. Right? Because this thinking about Jesus, this thinking about God, what Jesus says about God is like literally, it's the foundation of the book of John. This God of spirit, this God that is love, and this God that is the perfection of relationship. If you watch Jesus throughout that gospel, then you know what God is like. Jesus behaves in this way throughout. So that tells us that's what God is like. Again, we start with Jesus. We start with Jesus to find out who God is. That is what Christians do. Let me circle back a second to say that story of the person who asked me the question, is that God? I'll bet there's nobody in this room right now that would say, yeah, that was God who caused that guy to, Imagine how simple God is when you break it down to that. Spirit, love, relationship. Imagine God becomes so simple when you think of God in that way. Or at least, God doesn't become simple, but the way we relate to God, right? Her answer is super clear if you think of God in that way. Would God do that? Well, I don't know. Would Jesus do that? No, then it's not God. Would a God of spirit, a God that is love, and a God that is about perfecting relationship, that God cause that guy to crash and die? No matter what bad he did, would that guy do that? And for me, the answer is easy. It's no, because it doesn't line up with those things. Now, that's super simple. And so I just stood up here and said, God is simple. No, God is not simple. Because imagine how complex God is when you just break it down to those three things. Because loving is hard. Loving's not easy. So a God that is love is undertaking literally the hardest thing that we can do in the universe. Love unconditionally, always, for all time, no matter what happens. That's complex and that's difficult. The idea is easy, the application is insanely difficult. That's God, right? God is the perfection of relationships. We all know relationships they're tied in with love. It's super difficult. We can't even have one perfect relationship, let alone like with everyone ever. But that's God, right? And the idea that God is spirit is easy to say, but our minds cannot grasp that. Our minds can't grasp it. That's God. I mean, like, God is easy to talk about, insanely difficult to grab onto. To me, it's that simple, it's that complex. But think of this. Imagine this. We've been talking about childhood faith growing up to an adult faith, or maybe not. Imagine that God in a growing faith. Imagine instead of believing in bodyguard God, I'd believed in the God of Jesus, and then when I was 10 years old, my dad dies. How does the God of Jesus stand up to that trauma? Well, the God of spirit is beyond that, okay? But the God that perfects relationships wraps his arm around me. He says, I'm right here, right? The God of love, the God that is love, doesn't take that pain away. That God enters into that pain with me. Right? That God doesn't dissipate, doesn't get cracks, doesn't get destroyed when there's trauma. That God activates when there's trauma. That God exists beyond all of that and enters into it because of it. And if that's not Jesus in a nutshell, I don't know what is. That's everything we believe about Jesus. Jesus existed beyond that and then entered into it with us. So this God of Jesus doesn't run away from the trauma. The God of Jesus helps us with the trauma. It grows up. The next time I have a crisis in my faith because I can't understand the Bible in a certain way, the God of Jesus doesn't run away from that, doesn't fall, doesn't crack, doesn't explode. The God of Jesus says, yeah, man, I'm right here. I don't know what you expected. You know, like I never said that. You know, the God of Jesus is always there. The God of Jesus does not fall away when you grow up. The God of Jesus grows up with you. So, go read the book of John and but kind of sort of reaffirm that. And then the next time you have a trauma, maybe you're dealing with one right now and it's causing you to go, I don't know about this God. Think about the God of Jesus, how the God of Jesus interacts with you during that trauma. Seriously, that's just your assignment. That's huge. It's hard. It's big. It's big because if we grab onto this as a church, this idea that God is spirit, God is love, God is the perfection of relationship, it changes everything about the way we do relationships. Period, with each other, when I imagine what this church, what Woodland Park, what this world would look like if just some of us could grab onto this idea, I get goosebumps. Because that God is strong. That God is strong. And that's what I think most of us look for in a strong God. That God is the strongest God because that God can't go away. That God's always there when you need him. And even when you can't feel him. And even when bad things happen. And even when we uncover something new that we didn't know before. That's the God of Jesus, and that's the God that we should believe in. Pray with me. God, Spirit, love, relationship, you are perfect in all of those ways. I pray that when we feel your presence, and even when we don't, that you remind us that the gods that we worship don't always line up with you, but the God of Jesus is everlasting and strong and should be the God that we believe in. You are that God. I am so thankful that we serve you. I wouldn't want to serve any other. I pray that as we go out into this week, whatever we deal with, whatever we encounter, that we remind ourselves, that we are reminded, that we allow God to work in us to say, I am here, I am with you, and I'm not going anywhere.